Great. Good evening, everybody. Great to see you. Thank you for joining Mendy, Howard, Carolyn, and a huge thank you to Daniel Peled-Schwartz, our Rabbinic Intern, again for really deep thinking and deep preparation for our learning. This is going to be our ultimately second of two on our Shemitah series, and I hope we'll get him another time for what would have been the third part. But this is an opportunity for us to really dig deep and get a better understanding of not the agricultural dimension of Shemitah as much as the financial dimension of Shemitah. And excited for the learning opportunity for everyone. And thank you to Daniel. All yours.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm very excited to learn together. Howard and Carolyn, it's good to see you from last time. And we're last week we skipped, so now we're doing the second, and as Stephen said, it's going to be the last for this series. We focused in the first week, if the two of you who were there remember, we focused on Shemitat Karka, on the agricultural Shemitah. We talked about the different dimensions, both the more sort of environmental dimension of that and the more social dimension, talking about it through the lens of environmental justice, and the special sort of spiritual dimension of that environmental justice in the Torah that we got from the phrase Shabbat LaHashem, that it's a rest for God. And what does the fact that it's Shabbat LaHashem add to that agricultural practice that we have of Shemitat Karka? We're gonna do the other, usually considered the other half of Shemitah today, which is called Shemitat Kesafim, the financial Shemitah, the Shemitah of debts. Now, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Can we see the sources clearly here? Yeah, great. Okay. Yeah. So the title of today's shiur is Shemitat Kesafim, which again means literally the release of money. We'll get to what that means in a minute. The ideal and the real in the Torah's economics, because just laying out my thesis as we begin, I think that the story of Shemitat Kesafim is a constant back and forth in the Jewish tradition from the earliest sources in the written Torah until contemporary halachic authorities. It's a constant back and forth between the ideal and the real. The Torah sets a certain ideal of what type of economics the Shemitah year should represent and how that should change our societies. And things change and things become difficult and realities are different in each generation. And this is an area of halacha that has a lot of adaptation, a lot of change, a lot of dynamism as we go through the generations of trying to live in the real world while also striving for that ideal that the Torah originally set out. Like we did in the first class, to understand sort of for myself why I find these topics so urgent, why I find them so important, and why I think it's important the Torah has something to say about these issues, I want to relate it to something going on currently in our society. So we know there is a big discussion in our society about student debt. It's considered a pretty big crisis that a lot of politicians talk about trying to fix. I want to focus on a particular aspect of the student debt crisis, which is found here in this report in source 1. This chart that we have over here shows the difference between any it's in general Black households as opposed to any non-Black households, how quickly they're able to pay back student debt, right? Because the hope is that when a teenager takes out or a family takes out student debt for a child to be able to go to college, that they'll make the money back, they'll be able to pay it back. It might take a long time, but ultimately it's a good investment. But we see here that disproportionately, way more Black families, Black individuals in our country struggle to even ever pay back their student debt. Many more of them pay it back 40, 50, 60 years later. Think about that, going to college at age 18 and then only being able to pay back one student debt around retirement age. That's pretty jarring. And that makes that cycle of poverty even greater, right? If even those who are able to get into college and are able to get student loans, go their whole lives in this never-ending process of paying back their student debt, sometimes even never, that can reinforce cycles of poverty. And that is why this perpetual debt crisis can be so difficult, particularly on communities of color. I'm just going to read these couple of paragraphs from the report. Race and class dynamics place the heaviest loan burden upon low wealth families, particularly low wealth families of color. A JP Morgan Chase study found that 13% of Black borrowers are projected to never pay off their loans because the compounding interest outpaces their ability to pay down the principal. As the Education Trust reports, a Black bachelor's degree recipient is more likely to default than a white college dropout. Again, I just want to repeat that. A Black bachelor's degree recipient is more likely to default than a white college dropout. And Black borrowers from families in the highest income quintile have higher default rates than white borrowers in the lowest income quintile. According to our Brookings colleagues, 37.5% of Black borrowers were default at some point, compared to 12.4% of white borrowers. Additionally, majority Black zip codes tend to have higher student loan borrowing rates and larger balances compared to majority white zip codes, which means that the aggregate impact of loans depresses whole communities, not just individuals. Okay, just saying hi to Felice. Thank you for being here. So this is pretty intense information, and we can see how the student debt crisis is real for everyone, but it's particularly real for certain communities that have other difficulties, that have other disadvantages in our society. And it can ultimately lead to cycles of poverty that many of us know about who live in this country. If we were to stop here and say, what do we know of? What are any resources, text, ideas that we have in mind from the Jewish tradition that might speak to this sort of debt crisis, might try to alleviate it? Before we even talk about Shemitah, what are some ideas that anybody has about what the Torah thinks about this kind of debt crisis, about borrowing and lending? Yeah, Carolyn.
I guess there should be an interest-free loan.
Exactly, right? Thank you so much, Carolyn. Right, there's an idea in the Torah. There's at least between Jews, there is an obligation. There's a prohibition to lend with interest, and certainly, right, that's a really interesting and very difficult thing the Torah asks from us, is that if we lend, we have to lend without interest, and that could certainly alleviate a lot of this issue. I think that Shemitah is an even more radical proposal than the idea of loaning without debt. The idea of lending to others without debt is that the person still needs to pay back to you. But as we're going to see in a second, Shemitah, every 7 years, it actually totally erases all debt. It's a complete reset, economically speaking, complete reset of society. As we read this source too, as we read this source in the book of Devarim, which details the Mitzvah of Shemitah Kesafim, of releasing all debts, I want us to just think about whether, is there one mitzvah here? Is there one commandment, one value? Or are there really several different values, maybe even competing values, competing mitzvot that appear in this text? Howard and Carolyn, it looks like it's just the three of us. So do either one of you want to read, or do you want me to read? Great.
After a period of 7 years, you shall practice the release to Shemitah. This shall be the nature of the release. All creditors shall release the due that they claim from their fellow Israelites. They shall not demand payment from their fellow Israelites who can, for the release proclaimed is a bond. You may not demand payment from the foreigner, but you must release whatever is due you from your kin. Beware lest you harbor the base thought, the 7th year, the year of release, is approaching, so that you are mean and give nothing to your needy kin, who will cry out to God against you, and you will incur guilt. Give readily and have no regrets when you do so, For in return, your God will bless you in all your efforts and in all your undertakings.
Thank you so much. So, in terms of the question that I asked going into this text, is there one mitzvah here, or are there several? What are those mitzvot? What are those mitzvot? What do we see here? Maybe even conflicting or mitzvot intention.
You're only demanding payment from non-Jews.
Mm-hmm.
They're telling you not to be stingy in giving out loans when the Shemitah year is going to approach, because then you won't get your money back.
Right.
You should do it.
Exactly.
Without regrets.
Exactly. I couldn't have said that better myself, right? So there's a couple of tensions going on here. First of all, Caroline, as you noted, there is that tension between the way that we're supposed to lend and collect money from other Jews and from non-Jews, from the foreigner and from kin, right? That there is that Shemitat Kesafim does not apply to non-Jews. We're allowed to, collect debts that we might have even after the Shemitah year. But at least for the Jewish people, for fellow Jews, we do have to do the Shemitah. So that is certainly a tension. And the Torah is also drawing us to this really difficult sort of base thought, this devar bli ya'al, this evil thought that you might have, which is, oh, I see. Okay, so I'm not going to get my money back. Currently, let's say it's 2021, not 2022, and the Shemitah year is coming next year. I'm not going to lend any money to people in my community who need it, because I know that next year in 2022 or 5782, sorry, I know that in 5782, I'm going to have to forgive the loan. It's going to all go away. And so I'm not going to lend. The Torah is saying, no, the Torah is not a society that envisions no loaning, nobody having any money, no private property. The Torah envisions a functioning system where people do have money and people must lend it to each other, right? There's this motivation of don't think that because the seventh year is approaching, I'm not going to lend to the person who needs money, but rather do lend to that person and God will reward you, right? It will be good for you if you lend to that person. Now, again, like in our last class, Shemitah involves a lot of sort of statements like, do this even though you might think it's not good for you and God will reward you. So there are several ways to read that kind of statement. You guys remember what I said last time or what we said last time about that? Okay, so one of the ways to read that I said last time is maybe more of a simple, like a simple theological way of, if we do the mitzvot, God will reward us. That's certainly a legitimate way of reading this text. And I think it's true that if we do what God wants, God will reward us. And don't worry and don't have this evil thought of not lending just because you're not going to get your money back. And I think also another way to read it is a bit of a more naturalistic way of, if you build a society where people have enough money, it will end up being good for everyone, right? That a society that has vast amounts of inequality and spiraling cycles of poverty ends up being an unhealthy society. Even if certain people have a lot of money, it's not going to be a society that survives in the long run. It's not going to be a society that thrives and that has trust. So with those two lenses in mind, we can think about these two mitzvot. And I think that's, if we're trying to frame this year as the real and the ideal in the Torah's economics, I think that the ideal the Torah is setting out here is kind of a double ideal. The Torah wants there to be lending. It wants money to change hands. It wants there to be people who, if there are people who have more, to lend to poor people, right? Not to become totally closed in on themselves and unable to lend, but rather money should change hands. There should be loans and people should have to pay back. And for 6 years, people should really have to pay back their loans because that's how a functioning economy works. And on the other hand, in this ideal world, that relationship of debtor and creditor can't last forever, right? There needs to be that relationship, but there has to be a reset button that we press every 7 years. I think that's the ideal of the Torah. I want to pause here just to think about what that kind of reset button, what kind of change that can make in a society like we have nowadays. It's really hard to imagine what kind of change that would make in a society if we really had some sort of reset, some release of all debts. Any question?
That's kind of what I was thinking about when I read this, relevant to the chart that you showed before. If people are paying back their loans forever, they're never going to get ahead. Because the people who can't pay their loans back are the people who don't have enough money. And so if they're constantly paying their loans back, they're not getting any place. So they're suffering, the economy is suffering. There are enough people like them.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the Torah is trying to, on the one hand, have a functioning economy, and then also have that reset so that people do not, exactly like you said, that people who don't have enough money to pay back are the ones who have the loans, right? So we need to reset every once in a while.
Do those people who we're talking about have trouble getting student loans to begin with?
I don't know enough about that to answer that question. I wouldn't be surprised, but I haven't done the research. It's a good question.
It seems to me, if you're talking about today's society, if we speak about today's society, and there is so much inequality, and the thing that has to be done in some way or another is to recycle some of that money into the hands of people who maybe don't have anything, or who have, but they need a bit more. In this way, an economy works better if more of the people are able to spend, and then they can buy the products. And if you think back to in biblical times, they could buy more grain from that particular grower. But if they're destitute, they simply cannot.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's what this promise is that we had in verse 10, right? That your economy will be more blessed, and God will bless your economy more if there are people who have consuming the ability to buy products, the ability to function. There needs to be some sort of, again, not total redistribution all the time, but there needs to be a point at which we reset, at which some of that process that you were describing happens. Absolutely. Any other questions or challenges to this point?
I was thinking about if people in a community see that X amount of people went to college and they got a job, but they don't have any money because they're still paying back their loans, don't you think that would discourage other people and say, why bother? Because they're not doing well. That's a really, I hadn't thought of that. That's a really good point, right? Not only will it hurt those families, it can continue economic depression within certain communities, right? Because people see their friends, see how hard it is, say it's not worth it. Absolutely. And the cycle continues even worse. Yeah. And I think the Torah is trying to prevent that. Any other questions, challenges, comments until this point? Seeing the Torah's ideal? Okay. Now, one could say, I think that this is a good critique. One could say sort of, wouldn't everyone just take advantage of this system? Right? If there's a release of loans every 7 years, there's a release of debts, and there's no punishment, and you could do whatever you want with the money, and no one's making you do anything with it. And it's not even necessarily student loans that, the Torah is going a step further. It's not just saying student loans, it's saying any loans that you use on anything, that you use on fancy cars, don't have to be repaid every 7 years. Is that system going to be taken advantage of? And I think that the Torah recognizes that, and the rabbis in the Mishnah essentially have something of a response, something of a system that, although not necessarily legally enforceable, highly encourages people who can return the loan to do so, right? We see in source 3, one who returns a debt after the 7th year. This is a Mishnah in the Masachet of Shvi'i, which is the Masachet, the tractate that deals with the laws of Shemitah. If somebody returns a debt after the 7th year, the creditor must say to the debtor, I release it. But if the debtor says, even so, I will repay it,
the creditor may then accept it from him because it says, this shall be the nature of the release. Okay, so this is kind of surprising, right? You might think that once the 7th year comes around, there is a debt cancellation. That's how it looks like in the Torah. It's just gone, right? There's no more debt. Here, what it sounds like is there still is hopefully, the 7th year makes the person, if they can't repay the debt, then they don't have to repay it. But the borrower, right? If the borrower says to all that the lender has to say to the borrower is one time, they have to go up to them and say, they knock on the borrower's door and they say, excuse me, I am releasing my debt. 7 years have gone by. They have to only say it once, right? If the creditor, again, the Mishnah is saying the creditor, the borrower should say, right? Should say, if they can, I'm going to do this anyway. I'm going to repay you anyway. And that's the end of the conversation. That's what the Mishnah envisions. The Mishnah envisions that if the borrower is not destitute anymore, if they have invested that money and gotten something back, then they should have a responsibility to pay back that loan. It can't be enforced because the debt is canceled, but it gives a lot of leeway for the lender to go up to the borrower and gently, kindly, without saying you owe this to me, but encourage to pay back. And the Torah hopes that there is an amount of trust between the borrower and the lender. In this ideal utopian society, the Torah is trying to create, there's a certain amount of trust between the borrower and the lender. And if the lender realizes, you know what, I do have the money now, I've become rich in the last 6 years, that they will pay it back. We're going to skip the next source. In fact, not only is it permitted to repay a debt after the 7th year loan cancellation, but the rabbis say in source 5 in the Mishnah, the next Mishnah actually, that was chapter 10, Mishnah 8, this is chapter 10, Mishnah 9. Hamachazir chov b'shvi'it, somebody who repays their debts after the 7th year, ruach chachamim nochahim anu. The sages are pleased with them. And so we see here already this tension of the ideal and the real, right? The ideal is that there should be a total cancellation of debts. No one should be forced to do so. No one should be forced to pay back a debt if they can't. And so we don't want to make people pay back their debts after 7 years. That was the Torah's whole point, is that it's canceled, there's a reset. And yet there's sometimes a reality of people who maybe borrow irresponsibly, maybe can borrow, can pay back, and just decide not to. So the rabbis envision that a little bit, and they don't have the power to say that you must pay it back, because that's the Torah's point, but they encourage it. They provide a lot of positive words and a lot of leeway for the creditor to try to get their money back if it's feasible on the other end. So that's the first that's the functioning Jewish society as the rabbis saw it, as the Torah saw it and as the rabbis saw it. People don't take advantage of the system. If they can pay back, they do. There is lending going on. People are not saying in 2021, oh, I'm not gonna lend because the Shemitah year is coming next year. There is money that changes hands. There is a reset, and that reset really should only apply to people who can't pay it back. But if they can pay it back, they are encouraged to do so. That is a very ideal Torah society. Any questions about that picture that we've painted so far? Okay. Here's our first step down from the ideal to the real. Okay, let's go. Let's figure out what happens. This step is actually not like a socioeconomic or financial step of people, not doing what's right. This is actually a geopolitical step. What is the geopolitical step that happens in source 6 that forces us to go our first step from the ideal to the real? Either of you want to read, or should I read?
As it is taught in the Baraita that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, the verse states in the context of the cancellation of debts, and this is the matter of abrogation. He shall abrogate. The verse speaks of two types of abrogation. One is the release of land, and one is the abrogation of monetary debts. Since the two are equated, one can learn the following. At a time when you release land, when the Jubilee is practiced, you abrogate monetary debts. At a time when you do not release land, such as the present time, when the Jubilee year is no longer practiced, you also do not abrogate monetary debts. And the sages instituted that, despite this, the sabbatical years still aggregate debt in the present in remembrance of the Torah mandated sabbatical year.
Thank you. So we're going to stop here just for 1 second to make sure that we've understood. So the Gemara says, right, it's a braita in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, that nowadays there's no Shemitah. Nowadays there's no cancellation of debts. Why? What's it connected to? It's connected to the Jubilee year, to the mitzvahs of, we haven't talked about Yovel, but the mitzvahs of Shemitah and Yovel that we talked about in the agricultural sense. When those mitzvot are in full biblical force, when the entire Jewish people is in the land of Israel, back in the day, that is when the financial Shemitah, the Shemitah of debts, applies. But when there's no Shemitah, because not all the Jewish people are in the land of Israel, and again, there is a Shemitah year in the land of Israel on a rabbinic level, that's a different story, but at least on a biblical level, when there is the entire Jewish people is not in the land of Israel, that those laws don't pertain to the agriculture. And therefore, there's also, they're connected in the pasuk, in the verse. And so therefore, once the connection is severed, that's it. There's no more Shemitah of the debts either. We're done. No more Shemitah of the debts. You can, the Torah's economic ideal does not exist anymore. And we are left without a reset button every 7 years. What do the sages do? What did they say?
And the sages instituted that despite this, the sabbatical year still will aggregate debt in the present in remembrance of the Torah mandated sabbatical year. According to this explanation, the sages instituted that even in the present, the sabbatical year would bring a cancellation of debt, despite the fact that by Torah law, the debt still stands. The Gemara asks, but is there anything like this, where by Torah law, the sabbatical year does not cancel the debt, and the sages instituted that will cancel? It is as though the sages are instructing the debtors to steal from their creditors, as by Torah law, they still owe the money.
Right? That's the question the Gemara asks is, okay, so you want to have this economic reset, but nowadays, that's just called stealing. Because nowadays, we don't have Shemitah anymore, at least on a biblical level. That only happens when the entire Jewish people is in the land of Israel. How could the rabbis just decide to create a fictional new Shemitah every 7 years of debts when the lender, that money after 7 years is my money? You can't take that away from me. That's a really crazy thing to do, right? That seems like stealing from the lenders. What are the answers? There's Abaye and Rabbi give answers here.
This is not actual theft. It is an instruction to sit passively and not do anything. The sages have the authority to instruct one to passively violate a Torah law, so long as no action is taken. Rabbi says the sages are able to institute this ordinance because property declared ownerless by the court is ownerless.
Okay. 2 interesting answers, right? The question was, how can there be this new rabbinic Shemitah? How can that be? Because the Shemitah doesn't apply anymore. And in general, in Torah law, like in most legal systems, when I lend you something, you owe it back to me, right? And if somebody tells me that I can't collect it, that's like stealing from me, right? And there's no Shemitah anymore. 2 answers. The first one is that the rabbis actually do have the authority to say that a Torah law, the law of, getting your loans back that are owed to you, they can tell you to violate that if no action is taken, right? Nobody's actually taking money from somebody and forcing it out of their hand. They're just telling you you're not allowed to do anything. You have to passively sit there and not collect. That's one answer. The other answer is probably even more radical. It's that, well, the courts have this power in Jewish law. It's a very dangerous kind of rule, but for certain kinds of values, certain kinds of ways of structuring a society that the rabbis think are extremely important, the court is able to, what's it called in secular law? I forget. Eminent domain. The power of eminent domain, they're able to do this. And they essentially, this value of making sure that Shemitah, that there is that release every 7 years, was so important to the rabbis, even after the Shemitah year from the Torah is gone. It's so important to have that as a value in our economy that they use this sort of emergency power of eminent domain to make those loans be released every 7 years. Okay, so that's our first step. Our first shift from the ideal to the real is when we're just not living in the land of Israel anymore. We're not a unified people in the land of Israel. After the destruction of the temple, we're all over the place, and Shemitah doesn't exist anymore. The response in that reality is really strong. It's to bring us as far back to that ideal as we can. It's to never forget that ideal, right? Even though it's on a rabbinic level, which is a slightly lower level of legality, the rabbis had to go pretty far in terms of enforcing this. They had to take emergency powers. They had to declare eminent domain. They had to do things that they don't normally do in order to maintain this value of the economic reset, of preventing the economic downward spiral. Any questions till this point? Okay. The problem is that, as we mentioned at the beginning, there's not only actually one mitzvah in the Torah related to the Shemitah of money. There's two. There's, you got to lend money. That's important. You must lend. And there is, you must release those debts in the 7th year. The problem is that by the time the 1st, 2nd century CE came around, people were just not doing that anymore. It was just not happening. And there became a document known as a prusbul. Have we heard of a prusbul before? Do you guys know what a prusbul is?
I don't know what it is. I heard the term.
Okay, great. We're going to see right here what it is. So a prusbul is something that we're going to see in a second. Actually, the Beit Din of America's current prus. Actually, this is from last Shemitah year, right? 5775. So that's from last Shemitah year. But we're going to look at that document in a second. But it's still around. And this was the sage Hillel, who saw that things were going wrong. The Mishnah says, a loan secured by a prusbul, which means something like delivery in Greek. No, the historians aren't sure exactly what it means, but it seems like it's from the word delivery in Greek. So a loan that has a prusbul is not canceled. There's a way around. There's a legal loophole. This was one of the things enacted by Hillel the Elder, for when he observed people refraining from lending to one another, and thus transgressing what is written in the Torah, beware lest you harbor the base thought, the 7th year, the year of remission is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kinsman and give him nothing, right? They're just not lending because they don't want to not get paid back in the 7th year. So Hillel had to do something. He enacted the prusbul. So what does the prusbul say? Here's what the prusbul says. This is the formula of the prusbul. I turn over to you, so-and-so, judges of such and such a place. So I turn over to the court that any debt that I may have outstanding, I shall collect it whenever I desire. And the judges sign below, or the witnesses. Okay, so essentially, it's a symbolic giving over of the debt, or at least telling the court about the debt, and somehow involving the court in that, at least in a symbolic way, makes it less like I am doing something bad to you, like I am the borrower and I'm doing something bad to the lender. The court is now involved, and getting the court involved somehow symbolically makes a difference. When I get the court involved, it's like not me doing it to you anymore. It's like it's somehow the court's responsibility to collect the loan, and therefore I'm allowed to do it. Now, when many people think about a prusbul, when I first learned about a prusbul earlier on, I thought, wow, what a cheat. This is cheating the system. The whole point of Shemitah is this really important idea of economic reset. And nowadays, let's look at the Beit Din of America, right? This is a Beit Din here in New York. Prusbul that you can write if a Jew is in business with another Jew, right? Oops, sorry. Right, I hereby turn over to you to the judges, etc. All of the debts owed to me, whether or not the debts are evidenced in writing, etc. And you sign. Okay, and then you can collect, and there's no more Shemitah. The rabbis worked so hard, as we just saw, the rabbis worked so hard to make sure that Shemitah stayed in place after the destruction of the temple. And nowadays, what do? It's like selling our chametz, right? We just write it, we just sign it all away. You get the courts involved, it's not really us doing it anymore. However, I think that I judged Hillel too harshly. This is why I thought it was important to start off the class today talking about the two mitzvahs, not just the one. The mitzvah of Shemitah Kesafim is not just to release debts, to cancel debts. It's this dual mitzvah. It's this mitzvah of we need to make sure that people are getting loans. If people aren't getting loans, nobody wins, right? Then money just stays in the hands of the rich. What Hillel saw is that at a certain point, this is the sort of next step from the ideal to the real, the reality was that people just weren't lending. It wasn't like people were lending and things were going wrong. There were just people just stopped lending to each other close to the Shemitah year. So if we can't have both lending and the Shemitah year, at least let's have one, at least let's have some form of loan. So I think that I judged Hillel, it is a loophole, but it's a loophole that's actually in the spirit of the Torah. The spirit of the Torah is that it wants loans. It wants a specific kind of loan with cancellation, but it certainly wants loans. And I also think that Hillel on a legal level had a lot of precedent. This is the next source, right? So on a values level, we just said that he had precedent because the Torah wants loans to happen. And if this is the only way for loans to happen, then it needs to happen this way. I also think that on a legal level, there is precedent. Because the Sifrei, one of the Midrashim on the Torah, says that anybody who submits loan, this is a very early Midrash, right? This is a very early reading of the Torah, a much earlier precedent, said that if you actually submit your loan documents to the court, then Shemitah does not apply, right? Because it reads into the words, you must release whatever is due to you from your kin. If it's person to person, that's what the Torah is talking about. But if you literally hand over your documents, your loans to the court and say, I'm not involved, you collect these loans, that's not what the Torah, there is precedent for that. There's precedent for saying that a corporate government body can collect loans. So despite the fact that a prusbul goes one step further than that, right? It's not that you're actually literally, right? You don't literally give your papers to the Beit Din, to the court. You declare symbolically, right? Like it says on the Beit Din of America, I hereby turn over to you all of my loans. So what Hillel did with this prusbul is like, you're not really giving your loans. You're not physically giving them, you're not sending them the documents as a PDF file, right? What you're doing is you're symbolically declaring that the court is now in charge of the loan. So it certainly is one step further from this earlier precedent. But there is that precedent, so he's not making it up totally. And also it defends that value of lending, the very basic value of lending in our society. Because if the Torah's rules of Shemitah are going to stop lending at all, it's totally missing the point. So not ideal, but something that makes sure that at least on some level, we're doing what the Torah wants from us in terms of lending and borrowing. Any reactions, questions to the prusbul? Okay. So far, we started off with, we looked at a study, a recent study from the Brookings Institution that detailed the cycles of poverty that can happen in Black communities due to inability to pay back loans, especially student debt, defaulting on those loans. As I think Carolyn said, then people are gonna, in those communities, don't even necessarily have the motivation to take out loans to go to college because they see that cycle just perpetuates itself. The Torah says, stop right there. The Torah says every 7 years in our communities, we have to have a total reset, a total release of debts. That's this year, 5782, 2022. Now, that does not necessarily apply on a biblical level to us right here in New York today, because it only applies when all the people of Israel are in the land of Israel. But the rabbis fought very hard and took emergency powers to make sure that there would still be a legally enforced Shemitah, release of all debts in this year of Shemitah. The problem is that at some point, about 2,000 years ago, people just stopped lending because they didn't want to have their debts canceled. And so nowadays we have documents that we fill out called a prusbul that prevent it from happening. I'm going to summarize the next couple of sources, not looking inside because we're a little bit short on time. The next couple of sources detailed that this next source in the Talmud in Gittin just establishes that it asks a question. It says, does prusbul apply forever? Or did Hillel only create the idea of prusbul for his generation because there was an emergency situation where people weren't lending money? Maybe we can't do this maybe we can't have this kind of document nowadays. Who says that Hillel's rule applies forever, right? It's kind of like a loophole. Maybe we should not be able to do it nowadays. Maybe it was meant as a temporary measure. And in fact, the Gemara does not answer that question. It does not say, oh no, it applies forever. It says, actually, we don't know. Essentially, the conclusion is, because we don't know, right? We don't know whether it applies forever or not. What the Gemara concludes is that only very specific courts can make prusbuls, okay? Only courts of experts, of people who really, really deeply know the halacha of Shemitah can make a prusbul. So it's not like every few people sitting on a street corner can make a beit din in their city, in New York, whatever, and make a prusbul. This is a very special kind of document that needs to be dealt very carefully because it was meant maybe for a limited amount of time by specific people. So let's not use this too broadly. That's how the Gemara concludes, okay? This is meant to be done in a very limited fashion, and most people today should still be doing the prusbul. In fact, Maimonides, the Rambam, when he codifies the halacha, he says, Ein kotvin prusbul, ela chachamim gdolim biyoter. Only the greatest sages, like the court of Rabbi Ame and Rabbi Asi, two of the Amoraim, the sages in the Talmud, may write a prusbul. For they are worthy of extracting the money of people. Right? This is a serious thing because there really is Shemitah nowadays. And these are rabbis who are writing this document that basically takes money from one person and gives it to another. That's weighty, right? Not anybody can do that. But the other courts may not write it, says the Rambam. So this document is in trouble right here. I mean, maybe these are considered great. I'm sure they are considered great rabbis, but you need to look into it, right? Are these really great enough rabbis, like the rabbis of the Talmud, that they can write a prusbul? Or does Shemitah still apply nowadays? That's a question if we stop at Maimonides. The next step of reality sets in. People feel a need to write a prusbul, even people who are not sages in the Talmud. The Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law written in the 16th century in the land of Israel, records a prusbul makes a creditor's loan not be canceled. A prusbul stops the cancellation. A prusbul can only be written in an important court, specifically 3 judges who are experts in halacha and the rules of prusbul and Shemitah, and many people in that city rely on them. Because if you think about it, a court that people don't rely on and don't trust, it's not going to be good if they're involved in taking money away from some people and giving it to others. This is a very weighty thing. This can be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. You have to be very careful who makes a prusbul. But, he says, this is the next step of the reality, but yesh omrim dekotfim prusbul b'chol beit din. There are those who say that any court can write a prusbul. And it seems to me that we can rule leniently on this matter nowadays in the 16th century. Okay, not how the Talmud seems to conclude, not what the Rambam seems to codify in the Mishnah Torah, not what Maimonides seems to say, but people just really felt like they needed it. People, even Joe Schmo on the corner, felt like he needed to write a prusbul. I don't have any. I live in wherever, small town, name a random place. I don't have any great rabbis like the sages in the Talmud. Are you telling me that I can't lend to my neighbor and I can't demand payment forever? I think the real answer is, yeah, that is what it's saying. And that's what the Torah wants. But people just felt a need. There was a reality where people felt like in order to keep the economy going, they needed to have cancellation of debts. And so it became the practice that everyone relied on the prusbul in every location. I'm going to stop here at the cliffhanger because there is more. It gets worse. Any questions to this point? We've gone pretty fast in the last couple of minutes. So first up, the Torah is ideal, right? Lending, cancellation of debts, etc. Second step, we leave Israel. There's no more cancellation. The rabbis say, nevertheless, this is an important value. We're going to reinstitute it on a rabbinic level. That took a lot of emergency power, but they did it. Problem, reality, people are people, and they weren't lending to each other. They didn't trust that verse in the Torah that says, make sure that you lend. Don't worry about that 7th year. Your society will end up blessed due to that cancellation of debts. People did not trust God. People stopped lending. at all, and the Prusbul, this legal loophole, was enacted. It seems that it was only enacted for either a short amount of time, or for certain types of very, very learned expert courts to do. But you've gone the next step that at this point, by the 16th century, everyone is using it. But it gets worse because this is only the letter of the law. But the truth is that in medieval times, people weren't even using Prusbuls. They were just the Jewish people, it seems, not to speak ill of our Jewish people of the past, but it seems that people just totally ignored this part of the Torah, which was shocking to me when I saw this. Does somebody want to take over to read this letter that we have in source 12 in the 14th century?
Regarding your question about the practice in this land of Spain to collect debts from loans that have passed the Shemitah year, know that I have been astonished by this since the day I arrived to this land. I screamed like a bird about this, but nobody paid attention to me. They told me that this is the long-time practice in this land. We can't change the custom.
Okay, we're going to stop right here just for 1 second. This is the Tur, who was Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, who moved with his father, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, and their family. They moved from Ashkenaz to Sfard. They moved from Germany to Spain. And when they got to Spain in the 14th century, they saw what? What did they see? Sorry, I didn't hear that. Were people observing Shemitah, at least with a Prusbul?
They're not doing it.
Say that one more time.
They're not doing what this.
They're not doing it. They're not doing Shemitah. They're not canceling debts, and they're not even writing a Prusbul. It seems like they're just not doing it. Okay, and they said, "Oh, this is our custom. It's our minhag. It's our minhag to not do Shemitah over here. It's our custom." What did the Rosh, who is Rabbi Yasher ben Yechiel, what did he write in response?
And I responded to these people, a custom such as this, which amounts to a violation of the words of Torah, and charging money illegally, is not something the people should follow. They responded that they always include language in their loan documents that indicates that the Shemitah year will not cancel the debt. But I looked into the matter and did not find any such language. Furthermore, regarding that which you wrote, documents include the following language. Creditor shall be permitted to collect in any way he can, in either religious or non-religious ways. If this really means that the creditor can collect in non-religious ways, this is a stipulation that violates the Torah, which according to Torah laws. So, since I arrived here, I have neither actively enforced contracts which stipulate that the Shemitah year will not cancel the debt, nor have I publicly opposed their practice. Rather, I recuse myself and let them act according to their practice.
Thank you. So this was really surprising to me when I read it, because the Tur is a halacha book. It's a book of what you should do, right? It's a medieval halacha code, Jewish law code. And yet it just recounts this story that's like, and nobody keeps the law nowadays. And that's just how it goes. That's like really shocking. That shows that the Torah law in this matter of canceling debts every 7 years, or at least writing a Prusbul, is really difficult. It's really not the standard economic practice of the world. It really goes against the grain of how most economies work. And people just weren't doing it. People just weren't doing it. And in fact, lest we blame 14th century Spaniards alone, it was Jewish communities everywhere, because the Ramah in 16th century Poland, Eastern Europe, where my ancestors come from, says something quite similar. So in his gloss, in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, he says, the Shulchan Aruch, the law code said on a biblical level, the release of debts is only enforced when the Jubilee year is in force, but the rabbis established that the release of debts is enforced even nowadays, right? So we have a rabbinic level of Shemitah nowadays. The Ramah, 16th century Poland, says, but there are those who say that the release of debts is not enforced nowadays. So there are some people who just don't think that it applies nowadays. And it seems that the residents of these lands, Eastern Europe, rely on that opinion. For Eastern European Jews do not release debts at all nowadays. And we rabbis should not make trouble about this. That's a funny thing to see in a law book, right? And rabbis don't bother people. Okay, it seems like it was so ingrained in medieval Jewish society that it was hard for the rabbis to do anything about it. They didn't want to shake things up too much. We've gone from the ideal of the Torah of borrowing, lending, a functioning economy with a reset every seven years. We left the land of Israel, but the rabbis reinstituted that on a rabbinic level. People lost faith. Stopped lending altogether. Hillel created a crucible, this sort of loophole document that has precedent legally, tries to maintain the institution of loans, but does not make the seventh year cancel the debts. And then we get to the Middle Ages and people are almost forgetting about this mitzvah altogether. Maybe one can say that when we have legal loopholes like the crucible, centuries go on, we use a legal loophole, and people forget that there was ever a rule in the first place, perhaps, right? That could be the danger with legal loopholes. They might be the best intentions in the world, and Hillel certainly had the best intentions when he created the crucible. But at some point, it wasn't relevant anymore. People just weren't doing it. Here's where things get better, okay? I think things get better because in my own experience, in the last 5 or 10 years of being a young adult, I've heard of people making crucibles. I have, I don't know if I wrote a crucible because I don't think I had any loans, but when I was in college, the Orthodox rabbi at our college said, does anybody have loans for each other and need to write a crucible this year? Because, right, this is a document that exists online. The Beit Din of America has it. The Star K has one online. Other major rabbinic courts and kashrut agencies have them online. And I've seen people, taking this seriously and filling it out. So I think that we're getting back there, right? In our journey from the ideal to the real, I think we're getting a little bit close back to the ideal, a little bit, one step at a time, right? We are writing crucibles nowadays. They exist online. People write them now, unlike in the Middle Ages when those crucibles totally went out of style. We're at least remembering that there is a legal loophole that we have to use, if nothing else. I want to encourage us to go one step further. This one step further is based on the Ben Ish Chai. He was a Sephardi Kabbalist and halachic writer in the 19th century in Baghdad. Let's see what he suggested to his community. So one of you want to read for the last source?
There are certain pious people who, after writing the crucible, lend a small amount of money to their friends, only 10 grosh or so, and make sure that the crucible doesn't pay for that, since it was given afterwards. After Rosh Hashanah, when the friend comes to pay for the loan, they announce, I annul the loan and don't take the money back.
So what practice did Ben Ish Chai encourage for his community in Baghdad? He wrote crucibles, right? The crucible he was a...
People will still lend money to people.
Exactly, right? As many other rabbis in the world do, he spent some time handing out crucibles, making sure everyone was signed on them. That was a thing that was well established by that point. And in his community, they actually wrote crucibles, which is good. But he said, whenever he handed a crucible to someone, he would say, this is a loophole. Is there any amount of money, even a small amount of money, that you can loan to somebody who needs it in your community without this? I'm going to encourage you, when you sign this crucible, and when the Beit Din of America has it online, and the Star King has it online, he says, I encourage you to keep in mind some things to leave out of the crucible, right? We have the ability to write a crucible nowadays. We have the legal loophole. We have a way to lend money and that there should not be debt cancellation. And if that encourages more loans in our community, then great. But we're inching back. We're inching back to that ideal, right? It's not enough to just write a crucible. He said, make sure that even you give $10 to a friend as a symbolic gesture. Give $10 to a friend who has less money than you. And when they come back to pay it back, say, no, that's what Shemitah is. That's a mitzvah in the Torah. I'm not going to pay it back. Now, will that symbolic loan-free interest-free loan solve societal ills? Will it solve societal ills when there are interest-free loans on a sort of synagogue level? which does happen sometimes, it's not going to solve everything, but it's one step at a time. I think that the point of learning about these rules is to establish what is the ideal. Because so often when we have legal loopholes, like selling our chametz, or the heter iska, which allows lending with interest, or the prusbul, which allows the Shemitah year to not be in effect, in our communities, we often just don't even realize that's not what the Torah wants in the ideal. As we learn through these rules, as we learn through from the ideal that the Torah created, down to how things turned out, we can hopefully get back again. We can hopefully, one step at a time, not necessarily radically restructuring our society right now, but moving back, understanding what the Torah's ideals are, trying to structure our community around those ideals as much as possible, and starting with symbolic acts, we can hopefully get back to the Torah's ideal of a society that has a functioning economy, not just for some people, but for all. I'd love to hear your reactions, challenges, critiques, comments.
The thing is, this makes it easy for some people to get back into it. It's an easy way to get people to get back into it.
What's an easy way?
By encouraging them to just do small loans that they can afford. And practicing doing that with an amount of money they can afford to not get back.
Absolutely. I think that's why I love the Ben Ish Chai's idea so much, that last source that we saw. I thought it was a beautiful model, and I hopefully plan to do that. Yeah. Any other questions, critiques, observations? Great. Thank you all so much for coming. It's been a pleasure learning with you. And it was such an honor being the rabbinic intern here at the Bayit this year. What a special privilege. And I want to, even though this audience is not the whole show, I want to just take a semi-public, more public opportunity to say that Rev Steven is the best rabbinic mentor ever. And he is one of the best rabbis ever. And I can't thank him enough for a huge amount of time and patience that he gave with me, helping with the smallest tiny little things, the things that I was stressing out about and not making me feel bad about them, always making time for me. So thank you so much, Rev Steven, for being just an incredible role model and rabbinic mentor.
Thank you, Daniel. It was such an honor to work together. And Miriam, Howard, and Carolyn, they got a glimpse of the incredible depth of learning and thoughtfulness and bringing together deep Torah values. I keep using the word deep because it's really how I see you. Deep Torah values with broad and deep Torah texts for the issues of the day. And so I really thank you guys for joining. Thank you, Daniel, for spending the time to prepare, to think, to organize, and to present. I hope many people get to watch these recordings and learn from it. And thank you for a wonderful year. Looking forward to more opportunities to connect and grow together.
So much. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye, Tov.